and welcome! For today's DIY D&D, I will be making a dice tray out of a book. The dice tray that you will see shortly will be given to one of my D&D players, as I am a DM. I've made these book dice trays for all of my players, including myself, and they are a lot of work, but definitely worth it. Now that they're all done, none of my players have to roll their dice on the table, and hopefully don't lose their dice as well. And not to mention that this dice tray is super easy to store since it will be made out of a book, which you can just easily set on a shelf. Also, I just want to note before we begin that the dice tray footage sort of begins with a different book and ends with a different book because the book that I was going to use, I ended up losing some of the footage, so for the gluing process it looks a little bit different than how it ends up, but don't freak out, the books are pretty much the same. It was just made for another player, so just a note for that, for consistency. But I wanted to make sure that I had the whole process to show you to see how to do it, and so you can make your own book dice tray. And without further ado, let's get started, shall we?
For supplies, you will need the following. First, you will need a book. The book you want is one with a larger cover size so that you have enough surface area to roll your dice in. If you want to store your dice directly in your dice tray, make sure that the book you choose is thicker than your largest die. Next, you will want some glue. Make sure that it's water soluble, as it will be mixed with some water to thin out the consistency. Next, you will need a brush to apply the glue with. You will need an X-Acto knife or a sharp knife, which will then be used to carve out the pages. You will also need some parchment or wax paper. Then you will need something to weigh the pages together as they dry. I used heavy books as well as clamps, but use whatever you have. Optionally, you can grab some paint and paintbrushes if you want to customize your book. The first step is to glue the pages of the book together. But before gluing, choose which side you want to open the book from. I chose the front, and wrap that cover in parchment or wax paper to prevent glue from adhering it to the rest of the pages. Personally, I use parchment paper since it doesn't stick as much to the book as wax paper tends to do, but either should work if you're careful. Next, mix the glue with some water to thin it out, making it easier to spread along the pages. This isn't an exact measurement, just to make it a bit more spreadable. Again, it's important to use a water-soluble base glue that dries somewhat transparent, so no E6000 or industrial-type glue. Next, apply the glue just to the outer edges of the pages. It's important to not glue the middle of the pages because that will make it harder to carve the pages out later on. The purpose of the glue is to help the pages stick together because as you carve further along, the pages tend to want to separate. After this is done, apply glue to the edges of the book, also known as the foredge or text block. Make sure to do several layers of glue, allowing time in between for the layers to dry. You'll also want to put weights, clamps, or something heavy on the book as it dries so that the pages stick together more evenly. And make sure to wipe off excess glue before it dries completely. Now it is time to carve the book to make it into a dice tray. To start, sketch out the initial set of lines with a pencil to act as a carving guide. Be precise with each layer you carve. As soon as you start carving sloppy lines, it's hard to recover and will make a difference how the dice tray ultimately turns out. Try to carve your lines for each side in the same direction each time, or the pages below might want to pull apart. Another tip, if your pages start to separate, add tape to the outer edges to help keep them together. This is definitely the most time-consuming of all of the steps. I'd recommend doing this part in increments, or if you're ambitious, throw on some media to binge because this is going to take a while. For a time reference, it took me about 12 hours in total to carefully carve out this book, which is about 600 pages total. And I did this over the course of 4 days, making sure to take breaks so that my fingers and wrists would forgive me. I also recommend wearing some gloves. Craft or garden gloves can be helpful to protect your fingers from paper cuts. I alternated between wearing gloves and not wearing gloves based on how my fingers were doing. Now it's time for the final gluing. Before applying the glue, make sure to enclose the open cover of your dice tray with parchment paper or wax paper so it doesn't stick together with the other pages. You may have noticed that some of the pages that were glued have come unstuck even with the tape. That's to be expected, but the first gluing has served its purpose, so now it's time to do the final gluing. Like before, mix the glue together with a little water to thin it, which will make it easier to apply to the pages. This will help to flatten the sides and make them into sturdier walls for the dice tray. Doing this will also give the sides of the book a much sleeker and cleaner look. Apply more glue to the outer and inner edges of the page walls. This will help to flatten the book as well as hold it together. Then weigh down the pages by adding heavy books or whatever you were using before and wait for it to dry. Once the glue is dry, you can move on to customizing your dice tray. I added some paint to this book to make it look a little bit more D&D-esque. The player I gave this to is playing a druid, so I went with a more nature-esque feel. I added some leaves and vines and flowers to better fit her character's vibe. I also added some dragon runes on the side to give it that nice personal touch.
And with that, it is time for the reveal. Overall, I'm pretty happy with how this dice tray in particular turned out. I'm happy to report that the player who I gave it to, who is playing a druid, was very happy with all the little designs in it, and successfully used it in our most recent game, so that was super fun. I think for a future project, I might try to do this with resin to see how it'll affect the different things, and maybe the pages will stick together better, but we shall see in the future. If you're interested, I do have some various links down below to my social media and things, including my Etsy shop, so feel free to mosey on down there or leave a comment or like or whatever you want to do, and I will see y'all later. Bye-bye! I have made these DnD... Bleh. And as a bonus, you can take the book and just place it on the shelf. I've made these book drive. Blah, 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 blah. Blah, 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 blah.